Fresh off of a week where Sam was out in Louisiana taking in some high school and college football action around Southeast Louisiana. And since we last chatted, man, not a whole lot has happened. Not a lot of big news, I say sarcastically. We'll jump right into it in a second here. Jahkeem Stewart, the top-ranked prospect from St. Aug, is now at Edna Karr as of today. And so we'll talk more about that, as well as some of the latest LSU recruiting news and some of what we saw at our respective at the games that we were largely at together while Sam was in town. Sam, what's going on, man? How hectic is that phone right now, keeping up with all of the happy haps?
Yeah, it's no dull moments in the season. We're in it, and Jahkeem, obviously this is a developing situation. We knew that he would enroll either Monday or Tuesday. He's at Karr. The question is now his reclassification and his eligibility. Both of those, obviously I have already reported. There is a strong sense that he will be ineligible, but the door has been left open, as I was telling you privately before we kicked off. So be curious to hear what comes from the LHSA and what they tell us about more. So we're looking into that. And from there, the big question is whether he reclassifies, which is ultimately the goal and the reason he left St. Aug. So does enrolling at Karr as potentially a student, even if he isn't a student athlete, does he miss his junior/senior season and still be eligible to graduate in a few months? Does he maybe by the summer? A lot to still be determined in the situation regardless.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just kind of laying all this out, because I joke about how busy your phone probably is. My text message threads right now are full of a mixture of people who are kind of tapped into some of this, and also people who really are maybe in the sports world, but not into high school sports recruiting stuff at this level, and are just texting variations of essentially like, WTF, mate, like what the heck's going on here? And this is something that we've heard buzz about for really, to some degree, months. And then in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, it has escalated in a hurry. We talked about the reclassification dynamic here of Jahkeem trying to reclass that 25 class, finish up high school earlier, get to college and on to the next level as early as this coming spring. And then there was a lot of talk of, was he heading toward IMG Academy, whether, going to Florida or other options, potentially leaving the state. And then there were, some complications, curveballs, different dynamics with that. Obviously a lot else going on behind the scenes too. But how do we end up here? How do you kind of explain to folks that are not in this world typically, the baseline of this is what's happening, and this is how he now ends up on the other side of the river at a district rival?
Yeah, well, reclassifying is not uncommon, and it's becoming, I believe, increasingly more common for kids. Obviously, the faster you graduate from high school, the faster you can step foot on a college campus. And when you're someone in Jahkeem Stewart's position, where you're an alien to some degree, you're 6'6", 285 pounds, and you move at such a pace that you give offensive tackle, offensive lineman fits. You're physically superior to, majority, if not every player that you line up against, with the exception of only a handful in the entire country. But reclassifying, gives you that advantage of you step foot on campus, and you can compete for a job earlier. You can get in a college strength and conditioning program to build your body to its max potential. And also, this is 2024. It opens you up to accumulate the NIL value that you're receiving from your agents, from your colleges that are telling you this is what you're worth at your position, which Jahkeem is a premium position as a pass rushing specialist defensive lineman, and someone that was at the top of his class in 2026 and potentially would be among the best in 2025. However, that becomes a big question mark whether he plays this season, because he has one varsity season under his belt. The numbers are impressive, but certainly there's still a lot to be imagined because of the domination in a camp circuit. We saw this a little bit from Cardell Thomas back in the day. It doesn't necessarily always translate to on the field, and whether it was at St. Aug or whether it's at Edna Karr, whether it was at IMG. Wherever he played, we wanted to see if those dominating camp performances would translate to dominance on the field. And so far, I think that that's the one area that we're hoping we can still squeeze out. And certainly, I'm talking to sources within the last hour, the door has not been completely closed on Jahkeem's junior/senior season to be determined.
And I mean, look, his first varsity season, Jahkeem had an all-state caliber season as a sophomore. You obviously want to continue to see his development in that capacity. And I'm glad you mentioned the NIL component, because I was going to interject at some point if you didn't and say, let's not dance around or sugarcoat the fact that in 2024 recruiting, 2025 recruiting, whatever, the financial aspect is very much a piece of this conversation as well. I mean, he's a guy that when we didn't know if he was going to be in the state, I moved off of the Prep Red Zone preseason all-state team for 5A because I thought he might be heading to Florida. How big is it one way or another, as we look at an LSU perspective, the fact that he is going to be in Louisiana? Because I know there were a lot of folks that were concerned about the move out of state and how much not having that geographical advantage for Frank Wilson and company in the recruiting process, how much of a loss of a benefit was that in recruiting a national top prospect. For him to be still in New Orleans, for him to be at a program at Carr where there's 3 guys committed to the Tigers right now, that feels like a better outcome for LSU than it could have been if he ends up elsewhere.
Yeah, my mentions, whether it was some of the reporting from Friday, some of the recruiting impacts that I put out, and even today's news of him enrolling at Carr, it seems like there's a huge LSU contingent trying to determine. But the truth is, I don't think that whether he was at IMG or DeSoto, Texas, or Edna Karr in Algiers, LSU is going to be in this regardless. Frank Wilson was a mentor to Jahkeem's mentor. Frank Wilson has played a significant role in Jahkeem's recruitment already, and has gotten him after no matter how many out-of-state schools Jahkeem has visited. The expectation is that LSU will always have the last chance to stay in this race. Whether they get him or not, it remains to be seen. But Frank Wilson, Bo Davis from his time at Texas, and multiple people within the recruiting department, including Brian Kelly, including Blake Baker, the defensive coordinator, including Frank Wilson, again, the associate head coach, lead recruiter, Cortez Hankton, New Orleans area recruiter at that as well, involved in this recruitment. Definitely there is buzz around USC. There is definitely buzz around Ohio State. We know that Oregon is believed to still be, pretty heavily involved at this point. I kind of look at the other 3 with LSU, USC, and Ohio State being a little bit above Oregon at this point. But there is the expectation that even if it's perceived that he is leaning out of state, LSU will have the final say. And I don't think it hurts, obviously, him staying and continuing his high school in New Orleans potentially. But I don't think that it really mattered with someone like Jahkeem and the deep role that Frank Wilson has had already in this recruitment.
What's been your read on the reaction of high school coaches or the high school coaching community in the area about all of this? I know when the talk was about going to IMG, there was a lot of frustration from coaches of the idea of losing a prospect of this magnitude. And it's been the case anytime this conversation has come up with previous prospects as well, but frustration with the potential of a top Louisiana prospect being plucked out of state to head elsewhere. Now, instead of that happening, you have a top prospect crossing the river in the same district, the Catholic League, where there's certainly a track record of some guys switching schools through the years, but none of quite this level of spotlight. What's your early read on the vibes of what people are thinking, feeling, reacting about this?
Yeah, well, for sure, you hit it right in the head when you started with the threat of him going to IMG. Listen, in Texas, they do not like when IMG comes and gets their best players out of their state, and Louisiana certainly as well. And it has been tested time and time again, and more often than not, Louisiana has won to keep their best players home. They've done that pretty consistently over the years. And in Jahkeem's case, I think it would have really caused a little bit of an upstorm because the best coaches in New Orleans, the best in the Catholic League. This is a very close-knit fraternity. You and I are close friends with a lot of these people, and the pride that they have in their city and their league now, the Catholic League. Not to mention the other districts around the metro area, including the river parishes, but whatnot. The point still stands. There's a lot of Louisiana pride. The fact that it's a Karr thing, this certainly has, I don't want to say ruffled feathers, but like the alert beams are certainly on Jarrett. It's a lot of uncertainty that still needs to be hammered out, like we talked about. Part of what we can report on is that St. Aug was not willing to bend its rules for reclassification for mid-year graduates. I believe the number is 34 NFL players from St. Aug, including Leonard Fournette, including Tyrann Mathieu, and none of them had rules bent for them. That's not exactly the same exact case at Edna Karr, but there's still a lot to be determined there. So I think the coaches are just as antsy about it as you and I are, and they'll react accordingly. But I think that the uncertainty is still right now kind of keeping everyone looking with a curved brow.
Look, we've talked about this whole Jahkeem situation for 10 minutes or so now, and it's probably not going to be the last 10 minutes we spend talking about some of this as more continues to develop and solidify with his eligibility and all of those things. I guess one more question to wrap it up before we get on to talking about other guys and other recruiting news. How did this timeline play out? I think that's the most head-scratching thing to me about any of it is this is a conversation that we've been talking about in some capacity, again, for months, and now it is September 10th. We've already played a week of regular season in the LHSAA, and this is when all of this happens is, on the eve of kicking off the season last week, Jahkeem's being withdrawn from school, and then in the middle of week 2, when we're all preparing for storms and whatnot, we're figuring out where is Jahkeem's new school. How did this drag on this long? Why is this the timeline it unfolded on?
Yeah, well, you talked about us knowing about the possibility of reclassifying. From what I understand, the first time that idea was tossed around in the halls of St. Aug was about this time last summer, was when that was first thrown out, and that's been a goal for several months. And it's been a topic as Jahkeem has made his way around these 4 main campuses over a couple of times this offseason. And it seems like, first of all, week 1 might have been last week, but the kids at Aug and around the city have been in school for about a month already. But it seems like week 1 was circled as the deadline because, of course, Jahkeem played in the scrimmage. He played in the Jamboree. He played at a very high clip for that point. But it seemed like week 1 was the ultimate a decision needs to be made. And now, I don't want to say that the people waiting for the answer has kind of dragged it out, but it certainly hasn't helped, the situation trying to be perceived publicly, I believe.
You heard the buzzer in the background. I think that was actually for laundry, but we'll call it the Jahkeem Stewart conversation shot clock and move on to the commitment on it was Friday night that Walter Mathis out in Georgia announced his commitment to LSU, somebody that we've talked about on here and had mentioned really early August, feeling like that announcement was coming at some point, just kind of more a matter of when than if, but early looks at Walter Mathis film are a really nice addition to that class for, LSU's defensive line prospects. What are your kind of takeaways or I guess just notes on what LSU fans should expect about the latest guy to join that 25 class?
There's my shot clock again. It's beeping me before I even start. It's so rude. No, well, like you said, this has kind of been a long time coming. I think LSU kind of put its best foot forward when Mathis officially visited in June. He picks the Tigers over Auburn, over Florida State, which were also in the mix for Mathis, who's from Savannah, Georgia, South Georgia kid. But this is just another a theme of this podcast for sure. Blake Baker and Bo Davis need big bodies on the defensive front. They are trying to revamp that room. Obviously, in the last couple of days, the Jacobian Guillory news has been populating for LSU fans. And, part of the struggles for this staff is trying to find bodies now to replace bodies. And it's really hard to replace Jacoby and Guillory, a former Alexandria All-State weightlifter, power lifter rather. But this is, part of that effort. Zion Williams from Lufkin and going into Savannah to get Walter Mathis and so on and so forth. Jahkeem Stewart might be in the 2025 class. He might be a guy you might want to put in your recruiting class if you're LSU, and I'm sure they're trying. That's obviously a little bit of a joke, but for real, this is the point. They want to re-up in the most important spots. We know this is hard. This is what it's like to be on Around the Horn. It would definitely test my patience. But we've seen the way that Brad Davis has transformed that offensive line and offensive line depth, and I think now that Bo Davis is back in BR, this is and Blake at that as well, trying to add some depth, pad the depth on that defensive line first and foremost.
The games we had a chance to see, we were both at Central versus De La Salle on Thursday, Catholic High of Baton Rouge versus Destrehan on Friday. And then when I was heading back up to Baton Rouge to go watch LSU and Nicholls State, you were catching that St. Aug team against McDonough 35. I know, you've put out on Rivals a notebook of some of the guys that kind of caught your eye, and there were some great performances on both sides of the ball from each team in each one of those matchups. Just kind of talk us through as you get back to Texas and unload the notebook and are kind of reflecting on the weekend. Who were you most impressed with, whether in terms of a step forward they took, just an overall performance, or guys that caught your eye for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I was really giving it my best effort out in the rain, out in Destrehan on Friday. But man, did I walk away extremely impressed with Blaine Bradford. Listen, he was injured for a lot of last season, and he came back and made his presence felt very quickly for that Catholic team that obviously beat Acadiana in the state championship game. He had a big interception. He showed a little bit of that range. People question at 6'2", 200 plus pounds, can Blaine Bradford cover a lot of? He moves exceptionally well, and I think he moves. I mean, the way he moved on Friday night in the rain, bopping guys. He takes direct paths to the ball. He's able to cover 10, 15 yards at a time, make open field tackles. He can lay his shoulder down and really just, I don't know what he can't do. We saw that his ability to cover at LSU camp. He showed that same range covering and breaking up a Bryce Underwood throw during the 7-on-7. I'll never escape it. I just think that his testing out of the water, his physical play style at safety, and his position versatility, where he can be a high safety like he was for Catholic. He can play in the box. I think he might be putting himself like right in the mix. He's already the number 17 player in the country. So give me a break. But I think, he has to be firmly in that 5-star discussion at this point.
Yeah, he ran those 4.4s this summer, so he can fly straight line speed. And there's not a lot of guys that I would less rather be hit by in the state right now, because he arrives violently. And he, even with potential trouble, traction in the rain and all those things you mentioned, I mean, it was over and over and over again. He was just drilling ball carriers or receivers to jar, pass breakups loose and whatnot. It was, he set a tone for a Catholic defense that I thought hit hard and in a hard hitting overall matchup to begin with. Blaine stood out in that regard for sure.
Absolutely. You talked about a couple of passes defended. I mean, he is a physical brand of football, and I think the testing just shows he has range at the safety position. It's a weapon now for defensive coordinators, the way that they can be unleashed. And Blaine has shown there's nothing that he cannot do with his physical brand of football and the speed to cover so much on the back ends. It definitely had me thinking.
Similarly, I mean, a little shout out to Katie Mays in that Thursday game, another guy that is a really physical football player. He doesn't have Blaine's size, obviously, but the Central Baton Rouge kind of tweener, small linebacker / safety is someone that I think from an somewhat under the radar prospect that there's a chance that, a D1 somewhere finds a nice addition for them. Also, Stephen Raynell is bigger than I remember him being this time last year or throughout watching him much of his high school career. And he was playing pretty physically against, obviously, De La Salle, run the damn ball. Stephen was having to come up and help in some run support for the Wildcats defense, and then also had the big 4th down touchdown run through some contact to put his Wildcats up ahead. What did you think about, as much as we've talked about DK Mays, KD Mays, and old Steve Raynell on that defense as well?
Yeah, Steven is definitely a player I think could see his recruitment kind of, be a little bit of a late bloomer. I could see why teams were interested in him early. I love the playmaking ability at receiver, running back, a little bit of DB, played on special teams, and visited Tulane over the weekend. I think Tulane it's going to be a team to watch, could be one of those great John Summerall additions, finding just gems, and you figure out their position later. I think he's ultimately maybe a safety. I'd be curious to know how fast he timed, but he's a big body kid, like you said, very athletic, moves very well, and I love his versatility. And yeah, DK Mays and KD Mays. DK is a traitsy guy, little bit of stiffness, but he was able to apply pressure. I think he's obviously someone that if you're a Houston fan, you're excited about, in that big frame, playing hurt again in the rain against a very tough De La Salle team. When he's healthy, I'd love to just see, because he's so long, can be such a difference maker with that size and length. And KD, like you said, a little bit under the radar, one of these, nickel linebacker sort of, very good high school football player. You're really not sure what position they're going to play at the next level. But if he's able to find a home at a D1, I could see him maybe at UL, maybe, even maybe a little bit lower, like La Tech or McNeese, but, just a good football player, just, hustler, making great tackles out in space, hustling sideline to sideline. The only issue is at 5'11", 200-ish pounds, where does he ultimately line up? We don't really know, but he can definitely play somewhere on Saturdays. That's for sure.
Yeah, he's going to find a home, and it's going to be a place that ends up really liking the fact that they end up being his home at the next level. Bouncing back to the Catholic game, I just, stuck the defensive guys together there initially, but on offense, the varsity first start for the 2027 running back Jaden Miles, who ends up with the game-winning touchdown late in that game for Catholic High. That's a program that has a long history of some really, really good running backs, and he's a guy that already just getting going in terms of his varsity career has a lot of expectations, a lot of trust that in a rainy situation where there's trouble hanging on to the ball, Coach Hudson Fuller and company trusted this sophomore and said, you know what, this is our guy that we're really going to let carry us to a win in a top 5 to 10 type matchup. And he lived up to it with, I think, 129 yards and 2 touchdowns, and just kind of setting the table for what I think has a chance to be a really special sophomore season.
Yeah, Coach Fuller told us, I don't know if it was last summer or the summer prior, but he told both of us that he thought Jaden had a chance to be really, really special. And he happened to learn from a great mentor in Barry Remo, who was a 4-year difference maker for Baton Rouge Catholic, picking up for Clyde a couple of years ago. But you talk about a coming out party, facing a very tough Destrehan front seven with a dynamic safety in Jace Thomas, who was coming downhill at 100 miles per hour at the start of this game in the rain. I thought Jaden Miles got better as the game went on. Seemed like you talked about, he's a sophomore making his first start, and he only got better as his confidence grew. And he can run between the tackles. He's a bit of a banger at 6'1", 200+ pounds already. And then if he finds a little bit of daylight, it is really hard to wrestle him down. And he showed that. Jared, shout out to you. There were cameras breaking around you in Wildcat Stadium. People were fleeing left and right, but you got that footage. And Jaden Miles should thank you, because it was able to see just a fantastic game-winning touchdown run against, again, not to repeat myself, but a stout Destrehan defense that was loading the box to slow down the Catholic running game. And Jaden Miles ran through those tacklers. I think he has a very bright future. I think he is certainly one of those kids who we're going to be talking about on the rival side as a top 250 sophomore. But in his first varsity start, making the most of it, showing that physical Catholic cur dog running style. I mean, he might be the most physical back they've had to date. I know it's early, but the way he's built and, what we're going to see from him in November and December, I think we'll ultimately be able to circle back and say, Sam said it first.
The nice plug for the iPhone there, as multiple TV cameras failed in the moment, and we saw some foggy footage from other directions from allegedly better quality equipment. I mean, I take hell on those sidelines for recording with this, but this worked all night. The only thing I couldn't do was tweet throughout the game because the raindrops wouldn't let me unlock my phone, but I was still able to get to the camera. And, at the end of the game, Coach Fuller asked, "Are the cameras going to work right now to do this interview?" And I said, "Coach, I got every single play all night long. You don't worry about this iPhone. We got this. Let's roll."
Meanwhile, I had to put my camera away pregame. I did not take my cell phone out once, and my phone would not charge Friday evening for the water that was found in the charging port. Thank you, Apple.
I don't know how mine survived. I really went through that game waiting for failure at some point and just figuring I was going to get as much as I could until I couldn't, and that I might have to get a new phone this week, but it all worked out. Knock on wood, the phone's been working great this week. But wrapping up your weekend, the St. Aug and 35 game, you had a chance to see a couple of 2027, and we'll kind of stick with these guys. There's a lot of young talent on that St. Aug team. There's a lot of great talent on the McDonough 35 roster as well, including the LSU commit Ja'Kai Anderson, who we've talked about a few different times on this show. But Raekwon Williams and Miguel Whitley are two guys that I was really impressed with throughout 7-on-7 opportunities. And that's two guys on the outside with good speed, good size, can make some athletic plays on the ball in the air and make guys miss in terms of defenders trying to corral them. And Aug gets them theoretically for the next 3 years. What were your initial impressions on the type of weapons that they have on the outside with Ray and Miguel?
Yeah, so heads up, where Rivals is releasing their first round of 2027 rankings, and besides Ahmad Hudson from Ruston, who is probably going to end up being a tight end, as we've talked about here, Brandon Calais from Cecilia is another top 250 sort of prospect as well. And I think Miguel and Raekwon are both. I'm glad that we aren't doing the full rollout for Louisiana or the top 300 in the country, or 250 in the country, rather.
It's going to be a real fun class.
Because these 2027 receivers are for real. I happened to be at 2600 on Friday, and a very close friend of yours and mine said, I got a couple of youngsters, and he does not sell them short. Raekwon Williams, nicknamed Ray Ray. He does not like being called that, but sometimes his head coach calls him that. The outstanding body control. I was completely wowed by his not only his ability to play above the rim, but the body control, the speed to get downfield, a couple of tough catches in the middle of the field as well. But really his vertical ability and ball skills are surreal. And on to Whitley, who, again, a little bit of a bigger receiver, able to go over the middle, some in-breaking routes. Again, great ball control, great catch radius. These are 2027 receivers, and they are just chucking it downfield at St. Aug. Don't let me forget to obviously mention Tulane commit Warren Roberts was spectacular. He's playing a little bit out of position as a stand-up edge for St. Aug. He's going to play off-ball linebacker when he gets uptown to Tulane, but he's a hell wrecker at the line of scrimmage, super powerful. We know that he tested out of the water this offseason. He's got insane measurables. They think he's going to be a freak for the Green Wave, who looked very good on Saturday before K-State really woke up in that second half. And, of course, on Ja'Kai Anderson, the ball player, the LSU commit out of MAC 35. You want to talk about ball control and catch radius and just a smoothness to his game. Ja'Kai Anderson makes it look so easy. His ability to play through contact, to make plays after the catch. He has incredible hands. We talked about, some people, I'll say Josh Preston, saying, well, maybe he might be a better DB because he had such a great season on both sides of the ball for 35 a year ago. But he is such a playmaker at wide receiver. He is so natural watching him. His routes are great. He can work anywhere on the field. I think he's going to ultimately play in the slot, but I wouldn't be surprised if he grew another inch and became more of an outside receiver. But either way, kind of like Jamie French, I see a lot of similarities in just that fluidness and the way they move and the way they attack the ball in the air. That I just think he's definitely going to be one of these top 3 or 4 wideouts on LSU's squad one day, making a lot of plays for them.
Electric, no doubt about it. Well, look, you've got about 20 minutes before you have another scheduled call, and I know your phone is probably I know because one of my messages blowing up, we're literally both in the same group message, asking for more going on. I know you've got another couple calls to make, so we'll get out of here. Again, he's Sam Spiegelman. I'm Jarrett Roser. This is Louisiana versus all y'all's Recruit That Boot. We'll have some more on a still developing Jahkeem Stewart situation next week, as well as just some of our takeaways as this season continues on. But that's kind of where all this stuff stands for now, and appreciate everyone tuning in. Until next time, y'all be well.